I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but addressing a subject that matters to the entire world, namely the continued incarceration in the time of a pandemic of Julian Assange, the truth teller, the whistleblower, the world's most famous publisher. 8 years now, Julian Assange has been effectively under lock and key, for most of it in the Ecuador embassy, with the best of the British police gathered outside should he try to come out for a breather. But for more than 1 year, Julian Assange has been under effectively solitary confinement in Britain's Guantanamo Bay, otherwise known as Belmarsh Maximum Security Prison, where he rubs shoulders, or he would do if he was allowed out of his cell, with some of the world's most notorious terrorists and mass murderers, sex criminals, the worst of Britain's prison population, and all for being a man who published documents which the powerful in the world did not want the world to read. From my point of view, he should be sitting with a Nobel laureate around his neck. Instead, he is yoked in prison garb inside Belmarsh prison. We're asking today, why has Britain continued to insist on incarceration in Belmarsh when, with an electronic tag and a policeman or two outside, he could be spending the time, now extended until September, before the final hearing of his extradition proceedings, where the United States seeks to ship him across the Atlantic to face what is potentially 170 years in the injustice system of the United States. It's a difficult question to answer, but I've assembled my usual audience of distinguished experts, plus the enthusiastic amateur that is me. Now, David Lawley Wakelin is my favourite anti-war campaigner. He's the man that disrupted Tony Blair's testimony to the Chilcot inquiry and called him a war criminal with perfect timing, just as the police dragged him away. But he's also a distinguished documentary filmmaker. David, welcome to Kalima Horra. How would you begin to answer that question? Why is Britain being so vindictive in its persecution of Julian Assange?
Well, I think you can only imagine that it's because we're still very much a poodle to America, to Trump's, or the CIA in effect. It seems to be the secret services have a overpowerful world. They don't respect the International Criminal Court. They don't respect human rights. They don't respect the United Nations at all. In fact, as we heard, the United Nations have said that Assange has even been tortured inside his solitary confinement and on remand, not even charged or brought to court yet for a ridiculous period of time. The average time someone is on remand is apparently 14 days normally. So why are we in this situation? Why are we following America down this road of lawlessness, effectively? Unless you have a rule of law throughout the world to follow, human rights and so on, what chance has any other journalist got in future?
Well, they're always talking about this rules-based order whilst acting in a way that shreds all rules. You've mentioned the statements of the United Nations repeatedly on this subject, but there's some new scholarship. Some might call it journalism, but I think it verges on scholarship from the Grey Zone Project just this weekend, which reveals the role played by the security company, which was hired by the Ecuadorian embassy, but was in fact working for Sheldon Adelson and his gang in Las Vegas. He's the man who owns the Sands in Las Vegas. He's the big Israel backer in the United States and bankroller. This security company was literally spying even in the toilet of the Ecuadorian embassy, and more importantly, was spying on the privileged client-lawyer privilege discussions between Julian Assange and his lawyer, which, if you were prosecuting someone and were found to have been spying on that person's privileged conversations with their lawyer, any judge would throw it out of court. But we have, it seems, peculiar jurisdiction in this Assange case.
Yeah, it's incredible to think that apparently the CIA have been tapping his lawyer's conversations in the Belmarsh as well.
And burgling his lawyer's office.
So, which would suggest that there's absolutely no way whatsoever he could get a free trial, or a fair trial rather, in the States, in America.
Patrick Christys, you're a journalist, a broadcaster, a blogger. Fair to say you're a conservative. That's why you're
Broadly,
the only man here wearing a tie. But you are, first and foremost, a man that believes in freedom of speech and freedom of reporting. How does this all look from your part of the political spectrum?
Well, I just think this is absolutely terrible on a fair few parts. I mean, from a purely journalistic perspective, you go into journalism looking to try to expose some ultimate truths. Well, here's a man who's done that, and he could potentially pay for it with his life now. And this is not the way that a first world country should respond to it. The way I look specifically at Julian Assange's case is that the idea now that the UK doesn't support the death penalty is absolute nonsense. You know, you've got this guy there who's, let's be honest, not in the best health anymore, sadly, who's locked in solitary confinement, but within a prison system. The figures coming out, especially in relation to the coronavirus about the prison system in the UK, are nonsense. We've said that we've got apparently 65 cases across 23 prisons. Well, you're hardly testing anyone. And if that is the case, why have you got 6,000 prison officers and probation staff in self-isolation? There's no way 6,000 of them are off if there's only 65 cases among the UK prison system. They are happy for Julian Assange to wait there and to rot there, and I think that's really a dereliction of duty. Of course, as you said as well, the UN have been pretty forceful in saying that this guy's human rights are being contravened. Well, where do we stand on that? And for me personally, I just find that this is a very one-sided approach that we are taking to America now. We are being their lapdog, really, and Boris Johnson seems content to be led around on quite a short leash by Donald Trump in a way that isn't reciprocated. We have a very one-sided extradition agreement with the United States of America. I don't understand why we keep maintaining that. I think it's worrying for journalists, of course it is, but I think it's also worrying for civilians in other countries. Because when, and it is a matter of time, when we, probably alongside America, inevitably go on another crusade in that part of the world, well, what does this say to citizens over there who can be video recorded, being the victims of war crimes by arguably the most powerful state in the world, and you know that the person who exposes that is going to rot away in a jail cell? This is just terrible all round.
On that one-sided extradition treaty, we have a case right now of a CIA officer, quite a senior one, Anne Sakulas, who admits that she killed a young British boy by driving up the wrong side of the road outside a Royal Air Force base. She killed this young boy and then fled back to the United States, falsely claiming that she had diplomatic immunity. And the United States will not send her back to face a British courtroom.
This is it. And so there's that, right? But there's also the case of what side of history do we want to be on? And what kind of credibility do we have as a nation? We like to be the world's policeman, or certainly one of them, and we like to talk up our case for democracy, our case for human rights, this shining light in an otherwise dark abyss that the world is. Well, hang on a minute. You've got a guy here who has exposed war crimes, really, and we are now on the side, apparently, of the people who essentially did the war crimes.
Kevin Dooley, you know about the British prison system. You work with offenders and convicts and ex-convicts, but you're also a social scientist that understands the psyche of what happens to a man that's been 8 years under lock and key, and more than 1 year of that in Belmarsh. From your standpoint, what is all this likely to have done to Julian Assange already?
He's done a lot of time, not only in prison but in the embassy. So the psychological impact on him would be going into prison originally would be a culture shock for him. However, we've got to understand who we're dealing with. We're dealing with a man who's passionate, who's profound, who emotionally and mentally likes discussing ideas, likes to express himself. He's a creative, he's an artist, he's a journalist, he's a communicator. That's been robbed, that's been taken from him. Who he is has been robbed of him, you know. And if he's left in isolation, which he is, and especially with COVID-19 pandemic in prisons, which is just about to explode, yeah, we're only at the beginning. He's in, they say 23 half hours a day, 24 hours. It's probably 24 because they don't have the staff in Belmarsh prison at the moment to get people out every day for showers, for their health and hygiene. There's bad sanitation as well. So like I said, he's spending a lot of time on his own, banged up, yeah, and he'll start to regress within himself, and he might not have a mirror in there, so he hasn't even seen his face for weeks and months. I was in solitary confinement for 3 months with no windows. The light was on 24 hours a day. I had a pair of shorts, no radio, no booking material. It will impact mentally and emotionally. He will need to rebuild his life. He's been traumatised, he's been tortured, punished, cruel, inhuman. What's happened to him is inhuman, cruel, degradation.
Well, that was extremely powerful, and I'm grateful to you for doing that. It's worth making this point, isn't it? That he's not convicted. He's on remand. As David said, the average remand is 14 days. Have you ever known of a man to be banged up in such a prison for such a long time, in such truly unprecedented circumstances of a pandemic, on remand?
Yeah. The longest remand in Scotland, you can only do 3 months, 110 days. It's called a petition, and the prosecution has got to prepare your paperwork for court, whether it be the Sheriff Court in Scotland or the High Court. In England, I don't think they have a statute of limitation. You mentioned 14 days. I've never known anyone that's the average. That's the average. But like so, most people are remanded longer than that. And in Scotland, if you don't get to court in 3 months, 110 days, you can give you another 110 days, but there's no more after that. So you've got 6 months to do remand, innocent before proven guilty. So you're in prison.
Well, that is, of course, our pretense, David, isn't it? Innocent until proven guilty. Therefore, Julian Assange is an innocent man undergoing what Kevin just peerlessly described to us.
Yes, he's been taken away all human rights that any reasonable human being living in this country would expect for reporting the war crimes of nations in war, and as you said, the killing of other innocent journalists. It's just extraordinary that, again, as I say, I find it most disturbing that when the United Nations, which is the world body brought after the Second World War, it suggests that he's being psychologically tortured in a West European nation state as England, and yet this doesn't even make the 9 o'clock news on our BBC. Which kind of dictatorship are we in here? It's because of programs like this, which talk truth to power, which is what we're doing here today, that's the most important thing we have to keep doing for people like Assange, who are heroes, who, as you say, sadly, mentally disturbed, psychologically damaged for the rest of his life, undoubtedly.
If this was happening in China or North Korea to an Australian publisher, it would be one of the most important stories in the world. Let's take a view, because I did mention that Julian is not, of course, American. He's not British. He's not actually accused of committing any crime in Britain, yet he's being held here. He's never been in the United States, but he's on his way there, if they can pull it off, to 170 years in prison. He is, in fact, an Australian. So what's the Australian perspective on all of this? Let's hear from Jeremy Beck, who is the state chairman of the Australian Citizens Party.
I'm Jeremy Beck from the Australian Citizens Party. I'm part of the national executive in our party. We're federally registered in Australia. And we've had a big concern about Julian Assange. He is an Australian citizen. And we've been calling him to come home and calling our government to take action so that he can come home, because he really has not committed any crime at all. He should be considered an Australian national hero for all the crimes that he's exposed in the military-industrial complex and the banks.
The Australian government's doing nothing to demand the repatriation of their citizen Julian Assange. Why do you think that is?
You should really be asking them, but we've got a pretty good idea. I think the Australian government is very tied to the military-industrial complex through the City of London and the Wall Street banks and all the arms companies. And of course, Julian Assange has exposed all this apparatus. So the Australian government really doesn't want to know much about this, and they're going along with the whole agenda. So it's a big concern to us, because we've been told a pack of lies, for example, getting into the Iraq war, weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, and so many lies we've been told. So the Australian government really has a lot to answer.
Patrick, that's the long and the short of it, isn't it? You alluded to it in your earlier contribution. Australia's doing nothing because it too is a poodle of the United States. Now, it would be one thing to be a poodle of President Jack Kennedy, but Donald Trump?
I think this is the risk, and I know that you know, this is something that is being spoken about a lot as well, which is, you know, the risk for future potential military engagement as well, especially as goodness knows popularity ratings and the economy over there in America tanks. So I would have thought that there's every chance that there's something around the corner. And so if that is the case, then what precedent does this set for journalists who are now, I think, with the various online resources that we've got, in a better position than ever to expose, well, just wrongdoings, basically, criminal, deadly wrongdoings on a mass scale, in a way that we unfortunately were not able to do at the time, say, in Vietnam or something like that. We can do that now. Well, what message does this send to people out there? Well, if you do that, and if, you know, your son or daughter gets sent off to fight for your country in a war somewhere far away, and something bad happens to them, well, then I'm very sorry, but the government's priority is essentially sending another truckload of soldiers out there to die, as opposed to actually adhering to common international law and guidelines when it comes to freedom of the press. We do, you alluded to this earlier, George, you know.
Yes, I mean, it's a very good point you make. There's never, in theory, been a better time to be a journalist. Not only can you get information that would have taken you, I used to go to, you know, the Public Records Office in Kew and laboriously plough through acres of paper in order to find facts that now I can find, not even by typing into my phone, speaking into my phone.
There you go.
Tell me this, and Siri will give it to you. But not only that, you now can get your work out to millions, hundreds of millions of people at the touch of a button, in theory. But in practice, journalism seems to me very largely dead. And if Assange goes into the dungeons, it will be dead.
Well, as long as the international communities and the bigger nations' priorities is to make money off war, then they're going to try and strip back anyone who's got the liberty to talk out about any wrongdoings that are going on over there. Their priority is maintaining the quite murderous status quo in a lot of respects, as opposed to actually upholding justice. And that's the kind of in contradiction and hypocrisy that we've got now, especially as I've said before, one of the world's policemen, supposedly. Let's
hear more from Australia, from Jeremy Beck.
Well, really, he is not in jail for any crime at all right now. Officially, he has not committed a crime. He's in there waiting on an extradition order, but he sought asylum there in the Ecuadorian embassy and he was illegally thrown out according to international law. So really, he has not committed a crime. Australia should be standing up for him and saying he should be coming home. He should not be extradited at all.
Why won't the British government at least temporarily release Julian Assange?
Well, I've written about the subject, and I know that the UK government had an arrangement to release several prisoners. I'm not too sure what's happened at this stage, how many have been released, but Julian Assange applied to be released under the same conditions, considering the coronavirus would have a grave effect on his health. His health is already very compromised. So really, there's no excuse to keep him in jail, considering his frail state of health.
What do you think will be Julian Assange's fate if he does end up being extradited to the United States?
It's a very big concern for his health. He would likely be locked up for life, and his health would be in grave danger. Potentially, he could be tortured. Already, he has been tortured, according to Niels Melzer, the UN rapporteur on torture, who said he's been psychologically tortured. So it's a grave danger that torture would extend beyond that in the United States. In any case, he would be locked up for life, and the sorts of conditions he would be held under would be horrendous. Well, we're in dialogue with politicians here in Australia, and we're urging many to support Julian Assange. There are several who have already been outspoken, Andrew Wilkie and George Christensen, a couple, and there's a few others, a parliamentary friends group for Julian Assange, and we're urging more politicians to be outspoken. So far, it's been quite disappointing in terms of the leaderships of the major political parties. They don't really want to know about it.
Well, we should point out that the British government has released many prisoners because of the danger of the coronavirus. They have refused to release Julian Assange. They say that the prisoners who have been released could be released because they were convicted criminals. Julian Assange could not be released because he was not a convicted criminal. So you stay in prison because you're not a convicted criminal, but you might be released if you are a convicted criminal. George Orwell, double speak, thou should be alive at this hour. Much more coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen Television with me, George Galloway, coming from London, but talking about truly a globally important citizen. He is, of course, Julian Assange, the world's most famous publisher. He is accused of doing no more, even by his worst accuser, of publishing documents. And yet he is being subjected already to cruel and unusual punishment, even though he's been convicted of nothing. Now, the impact of such cruel and unusual punishment has already been attested to by Kevin Dooley here in the studio. Dr. Tom Piers is a psychiatrist. He had more to say about what this is likely doing to the publisher, Julian Assange. Doctor, how would Julian Assange's health have been impacted with over 7 years incarceration, first in the embassy and now in the maximum security Belmarsh prison?
I can imagine that we have to look at the stress that he's gone through over the past, well, almost the past decade now. The 7 years confinement in the Ecuadorian embassy, where, especially in the last year of his confinement, more and more restrictions are being placed on him. The Ecuadorian government changed about a year or so, a couple of years back. Rafael Correa, the president who was quite sympathetic to Assange, left office, and a US puppet, Lenin Moreno, took power. And since Moreno has been in power, certainly life's got worse for Assange. So last year in the embassy in particular, things were getting more and more difficult. His visitors, I understand his visitors have been restricted. He wasn't allowed out for medical care, not that he'd ever been allowed out for that. So he already came into Belmarsh a very sick man. The several months he spent in solitary confinement in Belmarsh obviously would have exacerbated that. I think it's a miracle, actually, that Assange managed to publish articles. He managed to publish dozens of articles. He published books. He did interviews from the Ecuadorian embassy. Of course, he can't do that from Belmarsh, but I think it's a miracle he's still holding on.
Aside from the impact on Julian Assange's health, what impact would all of this have had upon his family, his wife, his small children?
I mean, of course, the family is suffering too. My understanding is Assange has, I think he has 2 children who, maybe it's 3, but he's got children who certainly haven't seen their father, or I think one of them at least hasn't seen their father for many, many years. And contact with family was, I understand, very, very limited. Some of his family live in Australia, which obviously makes it hard for them to, well, not particularly easy for them to come to the UK. I mean, now when he's in Belmarsh, visiting restrictions are even greater. So, of course, his family have had limited contact with him over these years. They're also suffering.
Why won't the British government at least temporarily release Julian Assange, given that nobody claims, even his worst enemy claims, that he's committed a criminal offence here in Britain?
No, of course. He's committed no crime in the UK. As for, even in Sweden have dropped the allegations now. The only crime he's charged with is the 18 counts of espionage from America. But as we've mentioned or discussed, if it hadn't been for that, we wouldn't know about all the various misdeeds of America and its allies. Why the UK is acquiescing to America, well, that's obvious. We've always been the junior partner. So the UK isn't going to step out of line from what America says.
What do you think will be Julian Assange's fate if he does end up being extradited to the United States?
Well, based on the 18 or so charges that Julian's charged with, I mean, he could face up to 175 years in a supermax, a high security American prison. So basically, it's a life sentence, or you could say death sentence, because let's be honest, he's going to disappear down a black hole and he'll be never heard of again. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of those people who meets with an accident in the American prison, as can happen. So essentially, it would be a death sentence for him. It would be not only for him, it would be terrible for his family. It would also be terrible for journalism. This would be a massive strike against journalism across the whole world. It would be sending a message to all journalists saying that if you oppose the powers that be, if you oppose the rich and powerful, the elites, if you oppose any government's wrongdoing, then you could potentially face the same fate. The other thing as well is that governments could use as a precedent and say, well, okay, the UK extradited Assange to the US to face trial. What if, for example, other countries, say Saudi Arabia, didn't like what a dissident had written about them and demanded their exile? Potentially, any government could then say, okay, I want the exile of a citizen who's living abroad, I want the exile of anyone who's written bad things about my country.
That's the bull point, isn't it, Patrick? From the point of view of your profession, not only would it have a chilling effect, in fact, it would be a death sentence on free journalism.
Well, it would, but it's almost an international death sentence, because I think one of the things that journalists in this country, and clearly wrongly, have thought about this government is that it will fight your corner. If you were to expose something about a foreign power, for example, as happens quite regularly, that actually they wouldn't just be able to either A, come over here and do you some physical harm, but also that you would be protected if you have stuck to journalistic guidelines and abided by the UK rule of law, that you would not be extradited to some quite nefarious foreign power. Well, that's not true anymore, is it? And that's the thing. It's not just the fact that whatever country you might personally be in, however it likes to bracket itself on the world stage, how secure supposedly that country is. Well, if they haven't got a backbone, especially when it comes to someone who's supposed to be arguably our longest historical ally in the Strait of America, then you are knackered whichever way you dress this up, really.
More likely, isn't it, David, that the Francis Bacon's great line about self-censorship, it's an arrow that flies in the night. You don't actually see it flying, but it has its deadly effect. More likely, in the circumstance Patrick outlines, the journalist would decide, well, I'm not going to report that story because I might end up in the gulag.
Well, this is the overall intention, to stop other whistleblowers ever dreaming of spreading the word that, the last person I read whilst researching this was Sarah Tidstill back in the 80s. She was a civil servant who sold a story, or gave her story, whistleblowed her story to The Guardian. She was put in prison for 4 months at that time back in the 80s. Well, obviously Assange...
and it was a huge cause célèbre.
Yes, at the time.
Every
it was
liberal
enormous.
and progressive in the country
Yeah.
was up in arms about it, including The Guardian.
Yeah, but nowadays, with Assange, he's the example to lead all examples. Do not try and whistleblow against one of these Western dictatorships, as they seem to be. The saddest thing is that the rule of law, which is no longer, it seems evident, which started after the Second World War, is no longer existing.
Well, let me tell you,
There
as
is no
someone who was deeply involved, I was in Parliament. I was opposed to this one-sided extradition treaty of which Patrick speaks. And I raised with the then Home Secretary David Blunkett, now Lord Blunkett, who actually signed this treaty. It's his name on it. I said to him, what happens if the United States begins demanding the extradition of dissidents from Britain and now no longer has to show just cause, no longer has to show any evidence that what they're alleging is true? And the then Home Secretary, David Blunkett, said to me that I was worrying unnecessarily because on the face of the bill, now Act, it explicitly excludes the extradition of people for political reasons. What could be more political than what Julian Assange is being charged with?
Or clearer. Well, it couldn't be more clear, could it? No. This is clearly it only can be a political crime. And also, the strangest thing is that Obama released Chelsea Manning, who was... So there was no crime with Chelsea Manning, but there is with Assange? I mean, what is going on? He's charged...
Well, that's the irony. Chelsea Manning did commit a crime, because it is a crime if you're an American serviceman, as he was then, as she was then. Better get the pronouns right.
Yeah.
It is a crime too, and she paid for that crime. She was punished for that crime. But it can't be a crime for you to publish true material that comes into... If so, we might as well shut the newspapers. You know, the Daily Telegraph. The man who stole the evidence of British MPs filling their pockets and their boots with falsely claimed expenses committed a crime. But the Daily Telegraph, which published that material, was doing a public service, not committing a crime, surely.
Well, this is it. Well, the only crime that's been committed is the ones that you can see in the videos that Julian Assange has published and in the documents he's published. Exactly. Julian Assange has not committed the crimes at all. No. You know, it's just...
Otherwise, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Der Spiegel, all these newspapers around the world that published Julian Assange's material or republished it, they'd all be in prison. They'd all be extradited.
Well, how far away is that?
To the United States.
So what you're saying really is there really is no case to answer.
There's no case to
So there's no case to answer. He's not been charged with anything. He's staying in a prison with coronavirus running rife, and he's been there longer than anyone else in peacetime without a charge. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Welcome to Britain. Kevin, on the subject of families, we heard Dr. Tom talk about that. In this case, Julian Assange, the father of 2 young children, the Americans were instructing their agents, who were supposedly guarding the embassy, but were in fact working for Sheldon Adelson and his Sands Corporation, who were, of course, a front for the American CIA, gathering information. The children's nappies were being combed, if you'll forgive the imagery, for DNA to establish their relationship to Julian Assange, so that his children and their mother could be used as leverage against Assange. It doesn't get much lower than that, does it? Or much more dirty than that, literally, metaphorically.
Again, regarding his children and his family, and this is impacting on his health as well. If he's in Belmarsh, I think it's 1 year nearly.
It's more than 1 year
10th
now.
of May or something like that. So that means he'll be getting the normal visits, which is about every 2 weeks. So it's either 2 hours or 4 hours every 2 weeks. So you maybe get 8 hours a month.
Except now with the virus.
Yeah, the virus.
There's
it's
no,
not seen anyone.
there's no visitation.
But even with normal visitations, he will see his family for between 3 and 4 days a year. Let's just
Even in normal
a
time.
normal thing. He will not be near his family.
Unbelievable. Let's hear from Nozomi Hayase in San Francisco in the United States. She's an essayist and a columnist, but also a psychologist. We've got lots of psychology for you today because the psychological impact of all this, and not just on Julian Assange, is really quite considerable. Nozomi, the US refuses to cooperate with the government of the United Kingdom over the extradition demand of Anne Sakulas, who admits that she killed a British teenager whilst driving on the wrong side of the road outside an American intelligence station in Britain. Given that, why are the British cooperating so fully with the United States demand for the extradition of Julian Assange?
To me, this is a clear indication that the British government lost its own judicial independence. They became subservient to the US interest. They're simply following the order of the US empire. And this is shown how the UK court treated Assange during the extradition hearing in February. British court had been treating him like a terrorist. The British judge has been very cruel in the treatment of Assange. Judge Vanessa Ballister, she rejected the bail application of his temporary release, stating that no cases of COVID-19 having been confirmed in Belmarsh prison. And this judge doesn't care about justice, acting as if she's just reading scripts that are already written by the US government. And moreover, I want to emphasize one other thing, which is the US influence over UK judicial system is also seen in the way that the extradition treaty works. In February, the UK opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn challenged the Prime Minister in the House of Commons by raising the issue of the US extradition request for Assange. Then Corbyn argued how the extradition treaty between the US and the UK is unbalanced. And Boris Johnson even agreed with Corbyn on this.
What do you think will be Julian Assange's fate if he does end up being extradited to the United States?
This is obviously, I mean, he is facing 175 years sentences in prison. You know, he will be put into under the very harsh condition. I mean, there's the special measures that is known as the darkest corner of the U.S. Federal prison, in which he would be subjected to complete isolation, be cut off from any outside world, and he would be subjected to torture as well. I mean, so this is, you know, and then U.S. prison system is known to have really deteriorating. I mean, it's not a good environment for someone who, like Julian, who had serious health issues and who suffer from depression. So this is a extremely. I mean, we have to really be aware of the consequences of this case. I mean, if this case were to be ever allowed, we are now thinking about the death of innocent journalists. I mean, and then this would be the end of investigative journalism everywhere. And then one other thing I'd like to point out about this U.S. government prosecution of Julian Assange is that, you know, we are talking about this is the U.S. government going after Assange, but here, you know, who are really going after him? It is, you know, it is a deep state. It's intelligence community like the CIA. This prosecution is CIA's revenge against WikiLeaks and the war against the First Amendment. Remember what Mike Pompeo, the former CIA director, now Trump's Secretary of State, said Right after WikiLeaks published the Vault 7 that exposed the CIA hacking tools, Pompeo called WikiLeaks a hostile non-state intelligence agency and said WikiLeaks need to be shut down. Mike Pence, the vice president, also came out strongly saying whoever released those CIA documents need to be held accountable. So they want to end a national security reporting. They want to shut down WikiLeaks and make sure that there would be no WikiLeaks-like organization to ever emerge.
Wow, the whole case. David, you know, the only comparator that I can think of in this case is the brave Israeli Jewish whistleblower Mordechai Vanunu, who in England revealed the existence of Israel's nuclear weapons capacity. And then he too disappeared for 18 years of solitary confinement. I can think of no other comparator. And yet both of these men effectively were accused of the same thing, except in the case Vanunu was an Israeli citizen, so you could argue had some kind of duty to the Israeli state. Julian Assange has no duty to the United States, no duty not to reveal war crimes by the United States. On the contrary, as a free man, he had a duty to expose them.
I mean, it is, again, as the lady just said, the expert, you know, the CIA have to try and send a message out that if anyone else dares to, it's like the mafia. You could say it's like the Godfather. You know, we won't just get you. We'll get your children. We'll get your children's children. We'll be after you. You know, you couldn't make a mafia script.
Vendetta.
Vendetta. Yeah, it's like a mafia script from Godfather 6 or something to think what they would do to you now. And so Vanunu, and as you say, and Assange, would anyone else now dream of whistleblowing on their country? In the West, it does have an effect, sadly.
Well, we can't take the Kalima Horra camera onto the streets of London to hear the voice of the people, so we asked the people to send in their voice. Let's take a look.
I can only assume that both the British government and the American administration would rather have Julian Assange die in a British prison rather than go through the expense of bringing him for a political show trial in America and spend countless tens of thousands of dollars incarcerating him for the rest of his life.
Julian has been persecuted because he revealed American war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, rapes, murders, tortures, and the destruction of nations. The case also reveals how the Crown Prosecution Service, under the leadership of Keir Starmer at the time, colluded with the Swedish authorities to keep Julian's case in limbo for almost a decade, even though no charges were ever raised in Sweden. Julian's due process rights have been completely and utterly violated during the entire judicial process. And during his stay in Belmarsh prison, he's not been able to talk to his lawyers. He's now facing 175 years in an American supermax prison.
At the end of the day, Julian Assange is not one of a kind. There are many prisoners of conscience need international support in light of these difficult conditions. Shadi Habash, on the 1st of May of this year, has died in Egyptian prisons after making a video mocking the Egyptian president. Also on the 24th of April, Abdullah Hamid died in Saudi prisons while serving his sentence for his activism. Also since last August till today, Mais Abu Ghosh, a Palestinian journalist, is still facing physical and mental torture in the Israeli occupation jails. I think that Amnesty International, journalism organizations, human rights organizations, and of course the public opinion should take serious actions to defend these people's rights.
Hello, George. Yes, in my opinion, the reason that Julian Assange is still being held as a state hostage is purely because the elite want to send a message to anyone else who wants to expose war crimes that this will not be tolerated. But they will shoot themselves in the foot because many of us and many more are starting to wake up and We will not stop until Julian Assange is free. We will not stop. We will not stop. Free Julian Assange, or we will free him.
It is, Patrick, rather embarrassing for Labour people that the man who is their new leader, Sir Keir Starmer, QC, former Director of Public Prosecution, is up to his neck in the persecution of Julian Assange. It is it's hardly a Labour thing, you might say.
No, especially given that during his tenure there, they caused a controversy for apparently actually letting some quite dangerous people out early on parole. So,
Yes,
I mean,
and not prosecuting some very dangerous people.
So you've
Jimmy
got
Savile, for example.
You've got this
How many
rampant
cadavers would have been undisturbed if they had
This is it. So no one's squeaky
prosecuted
clean.
him?
No one's squeaky clean.
No, but there's a bipartisan approach to the persecution of Julian Assange. No Labour member of Parliament now will raise their voice to even allow him to go home under an electronic tag out of Belmarsh. Not one. Even Starmer has rejected this.
How strange is this? You know, that's just very, very broadly speaking, you're supposed to have the party there on the left of individual civil liberty, human rights, you know, fighting the case for the most vulnerable in society, and yet you've got something like this going on, and there's almost deafening silence on it, isn't there? Just one point I want to make as well is, if you look at who's doing this, and if the Five Eyes security group, as it were, are behind this, intelligence group, I should say, are behind this, well, they're really supposed to be some of the most free, liberal, free press nations that the world has to offer. Well, if they're the ones behind this, then is it not fair to suggest that maybe there isn't a free press anywhere in the world, really? Because if you know, surely they're the ones who are supposed to be upholding this kind of stuff.
Especially as there are not Five Eyes, there are six.
Yeah.
They only mention the five because they're all people that look like thee and me. The sixth pair of eyes is Israel. And that's why it's not a surprise to me that Israel's #1 lobbyist in the United States, Sheldon Adelson, the casino owner, is up to his neck now in this persecution of Julian Assange. David, last word from you. How is this going to end? Surely, if not at the level of the judiciary of these hacks who are considering Julian's case now at the lower levels of the magistrates' court, surely somewhere, when this is appealed and appealed,
yes, I can see
justice will out.
Well, I really hope not, but I can see him spending at least another year with COVID and so on, waiting for the vaccine and so on and so forth. It'll be, again, we'll be coming back here in a year's time, and he'll have spent, or the government will have spent yours and my taxpayers' money to keep this man inside, an innocent man. And my fear is that we'll be having the same conversation in a year, if not 2 years' time, and then the psychiatrist will be telling us that the man is a vegetable, a human that is no longer able to look after himself in any way whatsoever. And then, tragically, will he eventually be extradited? This is what we have to wait and see.
I'm maybe the only person here. I often find myself the only person in various companies that still imagines that there is something, at least higher up the English judiciary, that will see the legal monstrosity that all this is, that's in the High Court or the Court of Appeal or whatever. Am I being foolish, Kevin?
I don't know, you're being foolish, you're being hopeful, but this is about controlling information on a massive scale. We're not talking about just journalists, we're talking about people who can upload information to YouTube. This is the messages for the people. And he's incarcerated unjustifiable and illegally in every aspect. The pressure will build up. The powers that be are sending a big message out. And at the moment, he's in prison, but I know that he'll be supported by other prisoners who understand totally what's happening and what's happening to him. People go to prison to pay for their crime. he hasn't committed a crime, but he's going to prison and he'll be paying for that with his life because he's done the right thing for the right reason. And there's a big message. It's about controlling information worldwide, and our government, our embarrassing government, buddying up to America. It's really, really good that Americans have seen Julian Assange, who can forget, being dragged and fighting and still resisting, getting dragged out of the embassy. Powerful images, the signs of our time, you know. He's getting dragged away. America seen that, the people of America, they've seen that. They're beginning to change their perception about who he is and why he's in prison, and I don't think they'll support their government. I think it will happen here as well, even because they've now seen the contempt that our special relationship with America by saying clearly that the person that you want in conjunction with the death of a young man in a traffic accident won't be coming back over ever again to Britain. So the total contempt they've shown for our government, for our people, this country. So I think on a grassroots level, I don't think it's going to be the top. I think the movement will grow and swell.
So there you go. Julian Assange is safer in the company of the terrorists and murderers and rapists in Belmarsh jail than he is in the company of British politicians and journalists. There you go. British justice on trial. Julian Assange, will or not he ever be free? I've been George Galloway. You've been a marvellous audience. Thanks for joining me on Kalima Horra.